if I'm elected governor, I will have a mandate to shut down the open air drug scenes which are killing our people. And that is what we'll do. Well, if you had 150 to 200,000 people living in tents on the streets, suffering untreated mental illness and drug addiction because of an earthquake, we would not be sitting here acting helpless to deal with that crisis like we are right now. If it was from an earthquake or some other natural disaster, there would be a disaster response. So that is what I would do. I would have a disaster response to the crisis, shut down the open air drug scenes, shelter for everybody. If you're one of the 65% of the electorate that owns a home, you've seen your home values increase. The experience of people when they come to California is that things are more expensive. People see the headlines of the high gasoline prices, but people don't realize that if you use the Census Bureau's recommended method of measuring poverty, we have the highest poverty rate in the country because of the high cost of living. And so for me, I think there's this whole other world to California. For me, I always think of the movie Elysium, where you have this elite that lives up in the movie, they're up in space, but here up on the hills. And I think that's the California that gets presented to the world. It's the California that we see through the governor and through the socioeconomic class that he runs in. But we don't see the people that are really struggling and suffering under that high cost of living.
And do you consider yourself to be in a different social strata than the governor?
I'm definitely in a different social strata than the governor.
Okay. What's the most difficult thing that you've ever had to do in your life?
I think the most difficult thing I've ever had to do in my life is defend nuclear power plants from closing. You may know that California has a last nuclear power plant called Diablo Canyon that is still operating. I've been trying to save it since 2016 when I worked with my friend, the climate scientist James Hansen, to organize climate scientists to defend Diablo Canyon. There was only a minority of minority of public support for saving the plant. I was accused of all sorts of horrible things for speaking out to defend the plant. It was viewed very suspiciously. I took a lot of flack from people that insinuated things about who I was in order to do that. But in the 6 years since, we've prevented the equivalent of 24 million cars on the roads worth of pollution from being added to the environment by keeping nuclear power plants open around the United States. And we've also, I think, changed the conversation here in California. So you now see a plurality of support for keeping Diablo Canyon nuclear plant operating. That means that there's more people that support keeping it open than closing it, with a large share of people that are uncertain. But the conversation on nuclear has changed dramatically, and I'm very proud of the contributions that we made to that, but it was extremely difficult personally and professionally to do that.
Just in terms of the toll it took with relationships with people, with...
Yeah.
Okay.
The toll of personal relationships, lost friends, suffered. I still, if you go to my Wikipedia page, you see people lie about me and my motivations. They lie about things I've said. I suffered financially, actually, for that work. I refused to say things that I didn't believe in or didn't think were true, that even things that were popular among other pro-nuclear people. I think it's hard for people to understand, but I'm a heretic among pro-nuclear. So pro-nuclear environmentalists are already heretics. I'm a heretic among heretics in that I think that the existing water-cooled technologies that we have are quite good, and I'm very skeptical of the advanced nuclear designs. I'm not opposed to pursuing them. In fact, I think we should. But there's been a contingent in the pro-nuclear community that has basically said that we should phase out the reactors that we have because they think we can count on these advanced designs coming through. And I was unwilling to say that and took a fair amount and paid some pretty significant sacrifices in order to keep my integrity on that issue.
Can you remind us what your expertise is in nuclear power plants, and where did that come from?
I mean, really all of my expertise comes as an investigator and as a journalist. I've been a journalist since I was 15 years old. I'm 50, so I've been a journalist and I would say investigator for 35 years. I've co-founded 2 think tanks. I've co-authored 3 books, or I've written 2 books, sole bylined. I've co-authored a book, written many, many articles, but I am not trained in nuclear engineering or any STEM field. My degrees are in peace and global studies and cultural anthropology. So I did not receive any formal training to evaluate nuclear, but I came to my views by interviewing people around the world, including nuclear engineers. And it was actually in China where I went into China in 2015 with the idea that I would be persuaded of these advanced designs. But I actually went out with the engineers, and this is an old anthropologist trick, go out to dinner and everybody gets drunk. And the engineers tell you what's really going on. And what they told me was that these advanced designs are nowhere near readiness levels that the public relations officials for these designs had suggested. And that led me to really reconsider the direction of the technology. And I'm now, I've written quite extensively on nuclear. I'm under contract to write a book on nuclear that if I am not elected governor, that I will finish this year. But it really comes from those interviews and learning the science and the technology.
What is a political issue that you've changed your mind about over the course of your life?
Well, there's several. I've already spoken a lot about nuclear. That was a big one. I was an advocate for renewables as a climate activist from the 1990s to around 2008, 2009. 2010, I came out as pro-nuclear and have been a pro-nuclear person for the last 12 years. I've told that story before, and since we talked about nuclear before, let me say a little bit more what's the big issue here, which is that the bigger issue I've changed my mind on is the role of drug policy. I worked for George Soros' foundation in the late 1990s. I worked with Maxine Waters to advocate for the decriminalization and the federal funding of needle exchange. I still believe in harm reduction. But when I got out of that work in the year 2000, there were 17,000 people dying every year from drug overdoses and poisonings in the United States. This year, it's 106,000 deaths. When the death toll from drugs in the United States reached 70,000 in the year 2017, I asked myself, what did we get wrong? What did I get wrong on this issue? My understanding was we were trying to divert people from jail and prison into drug rehab. That was my understanding in the late 1990s. I really stopped doing that work in 2000 to focus on climate change and the environment. And so when I looked back, I tried to understand what had happened. And I think that the biggest misconception I had is that drug treatment was something done to you. That an addict would go to rehab and somebody would do something to the addict and the addict would change. And part of that is a perception driven by the fact that we do have a good opioid replacement therapies, first as methadone and now as Suboxone, which I wholly support. My views on this have been misrepresented in the San Francisco Chronicle, but I have always supported methadone and Suboxone as replacement therapy. But the process of addiction recovery is essentially an internal process. It's a process that somebody has to decide to not use, to achieve recovery and not use drugs or alcohol or any other thing they might be addicted to. We know that you can become addicted to many other things. So I think that would be the biggest, is that there is something, and I think that led to the argument in my book, San Francisco, which is that there's this idea in the human potential movement, or sort of positive psychology, which is that we need to embrace our resiliency, we need to overcome adversity, and that this is a very positive thing for personal psychology. And then part of the question I wanted to know in San Francisco is, why is it that that idea became demonized by the left, by progressives, when it came to things like climbing out of poverty, like overcoming addiction? Why is it that when I interview progressives, they say things to me like, well, we don't think that you should be promoting the idea that you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It seemed to me that what was being said was we shouldn't promote the idea that people can overcome adversity. And yet that's precisely what we know from positive psychology, the tradition of Viktor Frankl and other advocates of cognitive behavioral therapy. That's precisely the mentality that we know is necessary to overcome addiction. So I think to answer your question, there's a specific change I had in my mind of what did it take to achieve what drug treatment meant and what recovery from addiction meant, but that it was related to a more fundamental principle of we need to promote resilience, stories of heroism, stories of overcoming, and that we need to promote these internal resources and get out of this idea that we just need to provide something to people that we label as victims to reduce their misery and sufferings. And so much of that overcoming of their situation has to come from within.
Sorry, so your issue is that you feel as though liberals demonize just not being a victim anymore, essentially?
Well, it's, yeah, and it's okay, I'm sure you haven't read San Francisco, but it's basically, that's the latter half of that book. And I wrote an article called Why I Am Not a Progressive, which describes how, I grew up in the 80s, and in the 80s, my heroes as a young leftist, a young radical, my heroes were Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, the Latin American revolutionaries, and there was a heroic narrative. These were oppressed people who overthrew governments or changed laws, and it was a heroic story, just like the hero's journey story is a universal story. Well, now I look at where progressives are, and it's been overtaken by victim ideology. And victim ideology is this idea that you can divide everybody in society into victims or oppressors, that those are fixed categories, that victim status is something that you have by identity or by experience, and that and you're frozen there. And so what's lost, I think, and so to some extent, I've changed, no doubt about it. We talked about it. But I think that progressives changed in that we went from telling a heroic narrative, even in cases that I don't necessarily agree with anymore, like socialist revolutionaries in Latin America, but nonetheless, we've gone from that heroic narrative to a narrative that's really a pitying narrative, a narrative that is what I just think you would call victim ideology, or you might call wokeism.
So when you talk about a victim mentality, you're sort of referring to ideas of like institutional racism or things like that, but are very common on the left now.
I'll give you an example just from like a couple hours ago. I just testified in front of an assembly committee around supervised drug consumption sites. The advocates of this legislation got up and said, hey, the vast majority of people can't overcome their addiction. So it's like, well, right there, you're telling a fatalistic narrative. Actually, millions of people overcome their addictions every year. Millions around the world quit drugs or alcohol or other addictive behaviors or substances. So what are we doing telling us? So, the idea of telling a heroic narrative is not that everybody can do it, but it's that it's better to be telling those stories because and this is the argument I make in San Francisco, is there's an old philosophical debate about free will and whether or not it exists. And my argument where I come down on it is better to think it does than that it doesn't. Because if you think it doesn't exist, then you're much more likely to basically not take responsibility for your own life, not take responsibility for your own behavior. Now, structural racism, I think, exists. The most dramatic manifestation of it is housing. So I'm part of a civil rights coalition called the 200, which advocates for significant expansion of housing in California. After World War II, the record is very clear. Richard Rothstein's written a really terrific book on this about how the federal government, in a variety of ways, channeled African Americans in particular into renting apartments and channeled white families into owning homes. In California, of course, that meant that there's been a disproportionate wealth benefit to those white families. That's real structural racism. It really exists. We should recognize it. But that's also not the end of the story. And I think that if the message that we're sending to particular groups in society is that you are essentially victims, I think it's unhealthy psychologically. I think it's been proven to be unhealthy psychologically. We need to be getting back to telling that story of resilience, of overcoming adversity. I'm also part of a second civil rights organization called the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. That's squarely in the tradition of Martin Luther King. The tradition of Martin Luther King is the tradition of overcoming racism, of overcoming structural racism, of achieving a multiracial society, a society of racial equality. That's not a story of wallowing in victimhood. That's a story of overcoming adversity. In my first co-authored book, Breakthrough, I tell the story of when Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. He started it by telling a victim narrative, that first half of that speech, and then the gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, behind him said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." She had to shout it out to him because she had heard him riffing on the I Have a Dream speech in earlier speeches. And something clicked in him, he heard it, and he started to tell that speech that we're all familiar with, the I Have a Dream speech. But I do think that mentality shift matters. Do I think it's everything? No. But for me, that explains, I think, when you're asking the question, what's changed for me and what's changed among progressives, I think that is the fundamental issue.
And is that sort of the central reason that you left the Democratic Party? Obviously, that's in the last few years that you did that. So
it was last spring. I finished the manuscript for San Francisco, and as soon as I finished it, I did two things. The first is I changed my party affiliation to no party preference because I could no longer in good conscience be a member of the Democratic Party in California. Now, I went on to vote for Biden that fall because those were I had two choices and I voted for Joe Biden. But nonetheless, I changed my party affiliation. And the second thing I did is I started Stop Fentanyl Deaths with Jackie Berlin, who's a mother of a homeless fentanyl addict on the streets of San Francisco, which then became the California Peace Coalition, which is a coalition that I co-founded with parents of homeless addicts, parents of children killed by fentanyl, and recovering addicts. And we have an agenda that we'd been advocating for, and that basically has become my gubernatorial agenda.
But I guess, just to clarify, apologies, was it this sense of wokeism, or what exactly was sort of the breaking point for you with leaving the party, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it was yes, and it was the concrete manifestation of it in the insanity of our existing approach to the so-called homeless encampments or open-air drug scenes, where we are allowing virtually all of the women in those encampments to be sexually assaulted repeatedly. Nearly 100% of the women that I interview in those encampments report being sexually assaulted multiple times, where we're allowing people to overdose and be revived without mandating treatment or having some consequence for it. We're allowing 50 to 80% of all fires that are being put out in Los Angeles right now are in homeless encampments. Vast majority of those fires, according to my research, are deliberately set as arson. I think it's bonkers. And I propose to do what they've done in every civilized society, including the Netherlands, where I did my field research for San Francisco, but also Portugal, Germany, Austria, which is that you shut down the open-air drug scenes. You shut down the homeless encampments. It's not safe for anybody to sleep outside. I made this argument in San Francisco across those 400 pages, but we now know, looking at mortality data, I just wrote a column on it, that in LA, 3 times more homeless people died in Los Angeles between 2020 and 2021 than in New York, even though there's 14,000 fewer homeless people in Los Angeles. Why? Because New York shelters 96% of its homeless, and Los Angeles shelters around 1/3. We don't even know because the numbers are so terrible. So for me, you can hear my emotion on it. I am really upset by what California policymakers are doing to maintain and worsen the situation, in particular starting with the governor, who deserves disproportionate responsibility for it, since it was his set of policies that he implemented first in San Francisco and then has taken statewide. So it wasn't an abstract philosophical difference over free will so much as my complete heartbreak and horror at what is happening in California cities and in these encampments.
So as governor, you would be coming into a capital that is overwhelmingly Democratic, basically 3/4 of the legislature. How would you get pretty much any of your agenda done with a legislature that sounds like you fundamentally disagree with their philosophical approach to governance?
Well, precisely that way. I mean, let me back up though and say, if I'm elected governor, I will have a mandate to shut down the open air drug scenes which are killing our people. And that is what we'll do. Well, if you had 150 to 200,000 people living in tents on the streets, suffering untreated mental illness and drug addiction because of an earthquake, we would not be sitting here acting helpless to deal with that crisis like we are right now. If it was from an earthquake or some other natural disaster, there would be a disaster response. So that is what I would do. I would have a disaster response to the crisis, shut down the open air drug scenes, shelter for everybody. You don't have to use the shelter. People say you're going to make people go to shelter. Nobody has to go into shelter. But you can't sleep outside anymore because it's dangerous for you and it's dangerous for everybody else. We have we knew it before, but now the New York, LA mortality data prove that. And then we're going to have treatment first. You don't have to take the rehab, you don't even have to take the psych care, but you can't break laws and have there be no consequences. So there's some questions we can get into about what laws need to change, but there's a lot we can do right now to just simply, if you have sufficient shelter, you then are legally and ethically allowed to shut down the open air drug scenes, the so-called encampments. You can have triage stations, as they did in the Netherlands and Portugal, for people that need to detox and want to get off drugs. But if people don't want to go into them, they don't have to. They can go stay with friends and family. They can do what millions of other Californians do, and they can move out of state or to lower rent areas. But you can't sleep outdoors in illegal camping anymore because it's killing people. So in that disaster response, we will create the embryo of what I'm calling CalPsych, which is a single statewide psychiatric and addiction care system. It's the only way to deliver psychiatric and addiction care in a humane and efficient way to the people who are suffering and in need. Cannot be done at a county by county basis. My conservative friends say to me, aren't you talking about a significant expansion of government? I'm talking about reducing the number of government agencies from 58 to 1. CalPsych, CEO, best in class, reports directly to me as governor, regional directors, overseeing assertive case managers, case workers with a whatever it takes attitude, so that you can get away from this problem of somebody goes to rehab or they go into the hospital or they go into jail or prison, they come out, they go back into the encampments, overdose and die or just relapse. You have somebody there to make sure that they're getting the care that they need. It also eliminates the duplicative administrative services. It centralizes the payer system. A lot of the people on the streets, we can argue about how many, it doesn't matter. Significant share are from out of California. So we're going to get reimbursed through Medicaid for that. We got a really powerful congressional delegation to make sure we get reimbursed, but you got to have it centralized through CalPsych. The only reason the governor doesn't do this, because it's been recommended to him by Dr. Thomas Insel, one of his top advisors on mental health. He hasn't done this because he doesn't want the state to have the responsibility for this problem. He wants to continue to be able to blame the counties for the failure of this problem. It's deep cynicism on the part of the legislature and on the part of the governor. But that's what I will do as governor. If I'm elected, I will have a mandate to do that.
Great. Well, go ahead, Ben.
Well, I was just going to say, since we're on the topic of housing, I wanted to ask a few questions about housing, and if you don't mind me jumping ahead.
Sure.
So you mentioned that your overarching policy on this is shelter first, housing earned.
Yes.
Can you explain what exactly that means? What's the earned refer to?
So earned, housing earned is to do what they do in the Netherlands and other civilized societies. So what I saw in the Netherlands was people in shelters asking for their own private room. Everybody wants privacy, understandably so, everybody would. And I would see the social worker I was shadowing say, you got to take your meds, or you got to go to that job we lined up for. What is that? That's called contingency management. And it is the most successful way to encourage addiction recovery by far. In the peer-reviewed literature, I summarize all the literature in my book, San Francisco. I have a copy here to leave behind for you guys. It's actually contingency management, and I'm in a big argument, as you may know, with many people on my approach, but contingency management is actually an area that has a significant amount of agreement, including with Drug Policy Alliance, which is George Soros's main think tank. If you go to the Drug Policy Alliance's website and look up contingency management, you'll see that we are one on that issue, which is a nice experience for me, a rare experience on this issue. But contingency management works. It's not perfect, but it basically substitutes different rewards for the rewards that addicts are accustomed to getting. It's especially important for stimulant addicts because we don't have a good medically assisted therapy for stimulants, cocaine, methamphetamine, whereas we do have Suboxone and methadone for opioid addicts. And the classic research was done in Birmingham, Alabama with crack addicts. Crack addicts would be in congregate shelter. They pass a drug test. They get their own room. They fail the drug test. They go back to congregate shelter. They don't go back out on the street. I don't support anybody being on the street. You go back to shelter. Basic, simple, safe congregate shelter. But you then, what you're doing, getting back to this issue of free will and the internal locus of control, that the addict then is exercising responsibility for his or her behavior to then be able to achieve a better outcome.
Well, so you've said a few times that folks don't have to go into shelter, but they
Correct.
cannot sleep in the street. So
Right.
What happens if someone refuses to go into shelter? Where do they go?
Well, it depends on what is going on when they are confronted by law enforcement and a social worker. So let me answer your question, but let me just say, we want to get a lot of people off the street as voluntarily as possible. So the first thing we want to do is, let's say somebody overdoses and they're being revived. We know that that's an existential moment. We know that's a good moment to get people into recovery. A Cal Psych worker, I gotta use my phone for this part. Cal Psych worker says, Jim, we've revived you for the 7th time. Let's get you into rehab right now. We got an opening in Bakersfield, Eureka, you have family in Irvine. Great, we'll get you into Irvine on a Suboxone taper right now. Or if you don't want to come with us, my colleague, Officer Garcia right here, will arrest you. You'll be brought to jail because, as we can identify right here, you've broken the following laws: public camping, public defecation, open air drug use, drug dealing, who knows what the different crimes are. And therefore you have a consequence. It's all about carrots and sticks. Consequence for them to get into rehab. Do they have to accept it? No, but you do have to enforce laws. So I am, now to answer your question, yes, I am arguing that we need to enforce laws. We have laws against illegal public camping. We're not enforcing the laws. I know in California right now it seems kind of radical, but it turns out if you don't enforce laws, people don't follow them. And when they don't follow laws, then your cities become unlivable and unsafe. My 16-year-old daughter cannot walk around many neighborhoods in San Francisco. It's not safe for her. It's not safe for the people that live in those open drug scenes. So yes, there'd be consequences. Is it always going to be, let me say something else about this. I say to people, the person should be arrested. It doesn't mean they get incarcerated. Arresting somebody is not the same thing as incarcerating them. Could be, but arrest, which means to stop or apprehend, you might be arrested, you might be brought to jail, you might be brought in front of a social worker, you might be brought in front of a psychiatrist, you might be given a ticket. It's going to depend, there's an interaction between Cal Psych and the local law enforcement. I imagine the police in San Francisco are going to be different than the police in Fresno. But nonetheless, as governor, I'm going to be very firm that we've got to be enforcing these laws, because if you don't enforce the laws, people don't follow them, you don't have a civilization, but also enforcing laws is the interface at which we get people that are very sick with addiction or mental illness the care that they need.
And so what you're talking about would envision a pretty huge expansion of shelter capacity. Do you think the state as a whole, or places like San Francisco, have that capacity?
Of course not.
What could the governor do to override potentially opposition from neighborhood groups or even local governments?
Well, of course they don't have it. I mean, I've documented it in San Francisco. I'm very proud of the investigation here. I documented that the so-called homeless advocacy organizations have been the ones that have opposed shelters. And Gavin Newsom, as mayor, bent to the homeless advocacy groups, which are really radical left victimology groups that are dressing up themselves as advocates for homeless. They have maintained the open drug scenes out of a demand that people be given their own apartment unit unconditionally. So they've starved, this is all on Gavin. He's starved the budget for shelters. He reaffirmed this, by the way, last summer. I have the video on it. I've been tweeting it out. He starved the budget for shelters. So we got to create the shelters. But you would create, if you had 150,000 people on the street because of an earthquake, we would create the shelters. Once we have the shelters, and they're going to be clean, safe, basic, bad things can happen in shelters. But
or how would you get those shelters up and running so quickly?
There's a lot of different ways we can get shelters up and running quickly. And we're going to do this. The standard for me that I'm going to set is that it's going to be a humane response. What we have now is inhumane. So everything that we do is going to be more humane than we have it now. So we're not going to, like I said, nobody's going to be required to go to the shelters. If you go into the shelters, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that the women that go in there are not raped. Women and men are not raped, that they're safe, that they're clean, that people are treated with dignity and respect. I'm very open. There's some things I'm very firm on, like we have to enforce laws, and you need a statewide psychiatric care system. I feel very firm about that, uncompromising about it. Other things, can you bring your dogs in? You know, how do we transition? You know, what about drug use? Other things I can be flexible on, or especially in this transition phase. But you've got to move people off of the streets. It's out of control. And so, yes, it will take some time. I would like for the people of California to see a difference within 6 months.
So again, how would you do that? Because I think that's the thing that we're not getting to here is you want a difference within 6 months, but you know, within your first 6 months of being governor, you would barely even have a budget passed. So is there an emergency order?
Yes.
I mean,
I do not need to get the legislative approval to respond to the humanitarian disaster on the streets.
And where would you get the money to do this?
If I'm an emergency order, I can get the money. That's part of. I've got a team working on it, but I'm very comfortable about our legal basis.
So, is there specific funds that you're thinking about, sort of reappropriating toward this, or? If you have if you're responding to a disaster, which is what this is, you are able to tap significant funds to deal with the disaster. If there was an earthquake and there was 100,000 people on the street being raped and overdosing and dying, including people that are suffering from mental illness, you get the funding. You don't go through a whole legislative session while people are dying on the streets. So I'm very confident that I've read the actual laws on this and I've got a team on it. We can get the money, we can get this up and running right away. So you're talking about using the fund
Disaster.
for economic uncertainty?
Yeah.
Or
The disaster, just the powers of the governor to deal with a humanitarian disaster. I'm going to use those powers.
Okay.
And so just to zoom in on the housing question a little bit, I mean, obviously the state faces a housing shortage. You talked a little bit about that, but the cost of building a new unit, whether it's an apartment or a condo or what have you, it can be $500,000 or more.
Right.
Why do you think it is so expensive to build in California? What's the impediment? Is it, you often hear people blame the California Environmental Quality Act. Is that something that needs to be blamed or?
Well, I think you know very well, CalMatters has done a very good job in explaining why it's so darn expensive to build housing for the homeless in Los Angeles and San Francisco and elsewhere. So let me answer in a couple of ways. The first is that, again, you're going to have a a shelter first, treatment first approach. So to have this response, we don't need to increase homeless housing. We do need to make it contingency based, meaning it needs to be housing earned. But I do think we need an expansion of housing. We need an expansion of housing for reasons that go beyond homelessness. So, but let me put it into two parts here, because I think there's a question you're asking about how do we do the housing for homeless, and how do we expand housing more broadly. On the first issue, CalPsych is going to make a lot of this easier. If you come from Texas or Tennessee or Ohio, and you join and you're here for your addiction in an open drug scene in Los Angeles or San Francisco, I believe we have a moral obligation to provide you with shelter and medical care. Now, my conservative friends would say, how do you prevent people from freeloading on us? We're going to go get reimbursed on Medicaid. Okay, so we got a good congressional legislation, we get reimbursed on Medicaid. If we're going to treat a significant share of America's mentally ill and drug addicted people, we're going to get reimbursed for it. But I do believe we have a moral and legal and ethical obligation to get people shelter and treatment. They don't have a legal or ethical justification to have their own apartment. They can earn that potentially. We have a limited amount of housing they can earn, but it's not necessarily going to be in LA. They may not even get their rehab in LA or San Diego or San Francisco. This is why you need CalPsych. You know, anybody you fly over California, you know, we're rich in land. We have a lot of land on which you can build psychiatric hospitals, rehab facilities, board and care, group homes. My aunt had schizophrenia. She was in a group home. She did great. She smoked cigarettes all day, drank coffee, flirted with the staff. Great outcome. She never was homeless, never drug addicted, never became a sex worker, was never raped on the streets as far as we know. It's a good outcome. But there's no reason that has to be in the most expensive real estate in the whole state. That's why CalPsych opens that possibility. That if you want to be in group home, we get you in group home, but it may not be in downtown LA. It might be in Modesto, or it might be in Riverside, or it might be San Diego. I don't want to pick on the Central Valley. I'm just saying there's places with cheaper land. Okay, so that's the homeless housing issue. And as I said, it all needs to be contingency. This thing of giving free apartment units to addicts without any requirement that they change their behavior is horrible. First of all, it's a bad deal for the addicts, and it's a bad deal for taxpayers. But let's get to the broader issue.
Question of housing for folks who are not homeless.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. This is the hardest issue. This is the hardest issue by far. And the underlying problem with the housing problem is that everybody is lying to each other and to themselves. Everybody is lying. When my neighbors in the Berkeley Hills say that they welcome more housing in our neighborhood, they're mostly lying. And how do I know? Because when someone tries to build some housing, like a new fence, they will do everything to block it. And similarly, you see the same thing in the Mission District. I've lived in the Mission District in San Francisco. I've lived in the Berkeley Hills. People are just bunker in. And so we have a problem. So we have one problem, which is that everybody is a NIMBY, even if they deny it. The second issue is that we have too much dogmatism. We have the YIMBYs, who I am spiritually sympathetic to, because I think that you do need more density in the cities near mass transit. It's obvious. But they're so dogmatic in saying that only density, and then they say no suburbs, no exurbs. I'm not saying all of them say that, but there's a significant contingent that do. They're dogmatic about it. When you go to the NYU cities database and you look at how cities grow, as I have done, and I debunked Noah Smith on this issue a few years ago, all cities grow the same way. They all grow the same way. They expand and they grow up. There's been this idea from the YIMBYs that, Tokyo just added density. It didn't sprawl. Tokyo sprawled too. So all cities grow out and they grow up at the same time. So I think once you acknowledge that, now people say, well, what about our beautiful green belts and our open, we don't want to mess with that. We want to protect our redwoods, we want to protect Yosemite, we want to protect the green belts, but we have ranch lands and farms that are traditionally what get converted into new housing developments. We should use them. I mean, if we're not going to use them for that, if you want to have some more cattle ranches, then they should pay the appropriate taxation to be depriving the rest of the society housing there. So I think that you have to create a societal consensus on this. I think only the governor can do that. I think I'm the only person that's talking about how to do that. I know how to do that. You have to create a citizens jury. What is a citizens jury? It's where you impanel several hundred randomly selected representative sample of the electorate to participate in, let's say, 12 town hall meetings across the state that last, let's say, 2 or 3 days each over a period of a year or 9 months, let's say 2023 to 2024, and you build consensus and you have debates and you have people talk to experts and you get to some, set of recommendations, some societal consensus, something where somewhere between, let's say, 70 to 80% of the people in the citizens jury are on board with a basic framework of how to expand housing in California. It's not a substitute for the legislative hearing process or for legislative hearings, but they then can come back and you have a societal consensus, the social media involved, the news media involved, and we can be grown-ups about this. And I think what we will come to is some sense of reciprocity. I think that we're in a prisoner's dilemma issue here, which is that people in the Mission District and the cities, they say, well, you're just going to dump big apartment buildings on us. What about the suburbs? What about the Berkeley Hills? People in Berkeley Hills say, I don't want it here. Why don't you do it in the Mission District or in the ranch lands? There needs to be something that people feel bound together. And then you get it to the legislature or you do a ballot initiative, and it's a societal consensus that can last for 50 years. Not 4 years, not 8 years, but the long period of time. I saw this work in South Korea. They've done citizens juries in Germany. If you don't have a societal consensus on this housing issue, we're just not going to get more housing. YIMBY's tried to just muscle everybody into the SB 50 Wiener approach, and it didn't work because we're a democracy and voters didn't want that. So if you want to actually get this done, you got to build a societal consensus.
So if I understand you correctly, the idea of the citizens panel would be transparent and deliberative enough so that people who currently do not want housing in their neighborhoods would drop their opposition?
No, but they would. I think that there is the 65%. Ostensibly, if you look at the polling, that say they would accept more housing in their neighborhoods. But then when it comes into their neighborhoods, they oppose it. So I am betting, my calculation is that that the opposition will be reduced and support will increase if people see that it's a California-wide proposal to expand housing. I might be wrong. And if I'm wrong, then we're just doomed to be like Hawaii and not add significantly more housing and become a retirement community for affluent Americans. That would make me sad, but if that's what the California electorate want, as governor, that's what we're going to have. There's no short-circuiting democracy here. As one of the Cal YIMBY staff people told me, the problem is big voter. So if you don't get the voters on board, there is no expansion of housing. And so Gavin can kind of go, I'm going to do 500,000 units a year, and he was just BSing. He had no vision for how you get that. I have a vision for how you build consensus. Will it work? I think so, but we'll find out. I don't see any other way to significantly expand housing in the state without building out societal consensus first.
So, as we know, voters are looking to the governor to solve lots of other issues as well.
Yeah.
So let's move on to some other policies.
Let's
So Ben, do you want to talk about crime a little bit?
Sure, yeah, and I'll just quickly cover a couple of crime questions if you don't mind. So one is about mass shootings, the threat of mass shootings, which is obviously on all of our minds right now.
Yeah.
In response to your prior question about this, about what the state could do to prevent mass shootings or reduce them at least, you said a well-functioning criminal justice system can prevent mass shootings. So what does that justice system
Can or
look
can't?
like?
Did I say?
Can.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
Are you saying I said that?
I thought you did in response to some questions that we had earlier, but
Today, did I say that? I don't.
So if I misunderstood.
I think,
Then I'll back up. So
I didn't
how-
say. I don't. If I said that, I didn't mean. I don't remember saying that.
Okay, my apologies. So let me just start more broadly then. So do you think the state can play a role to prevent mass shootings?
Absolutely, and has. We do have fewer mass shootings in California. Not as perfect as the governor's made it sound. We can do a lot better, but absolutely we can prevent mass shootings. Of course we can.
How?
Well, we've already made a huge amount of progress on this issue. I mean, there's really, I haven't found a single difference between my views of gun safety and the governor's. So, yeah, I mean, now of course I would need to.
It's just to help voters understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
So it's not a
Yeah.
criticism of you. We
No,
just
no,
want
it's
people
fine.
to understand what your perspective is on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's there's gun safety, which we need, I mean, all of it. Background checks, red flag system, assault weapon bans. Again, these are for mass shootings. Better training for law enforcement. The police, apparently in the Uvalde case, they thought that the active shooter had turned into a bunkered shooter. They made a mistake, but that means that they needed even better training. So you need even more police training. I'm a huge advocate for increasing the number of police. We need more police. We need at least 500 to 700 more police officers in San Francisco. I think we need closer to 1,000 new police officers in Los Angeles. One of the most surprising things from my research is that Europe has significantly more police officers per capita than we have in the United States. California has much fewer police officers per capita than other states. We need more police. We need to work very hard to expand policing. And that means when you have more police, you have more time for training. You can also get rid of bad actors much more easily if you have significant police. I want to raise the esteem of the police. I want to do whatever we need to do to get more police. So that's the first thing. But in terms of the gun safety things that are being proposed, they all sound pretty darn good to me. I mean, I want to review them specifically. We can get into the weeds on it. But yeah, I mean, look, one of my best friends from high school was shot in the back of the head and killed. And he was he was like one of the great up and coming stars of my high school. And it had a big effect on me personally. I take the issue very seriously. And I don't see any difference between me and the governor on it.
Since policing is usually a local budget decision, would you propose as governor to spend significant state funds to
Yes.
expand local police?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would lean on the mayors and use the bully pulpit, and I would explain to the society that police are good. I mean, I was never really anti-police, even in my most radical days. They were always somewhat scary to me, but I was never a defund the police guy. But after I did my research and looked at the empirical evidence, police are really good. If you are worried about mass incarceration, you should want more police, because police prevent crime, and crime is what allows mass incarceration. So police prevent homicides. They prevent all sorts of crime. They have a deterrent effect. It's well established in the literature. There's been multiple studies done. So I want more police. And there's money, yes. But there's also, like, when you talk to cops and you try to understand why there was this depolicing reaction, actually since Ferguson, which I believe was 2015, but certainly after 2020, George Floyd, and you talk to cops and you go, why are you leaving the police force? Or why are you retiring early? Or why did you leave the state? It's not just like money, it's just morale. It's just the feeling that people hate them. It's the feeling people say, having cell phones held up to me every time we're engaging somebody. It's the sense in which police have been mistreated. And I think if you had to summarize my views, I'm pro-civilization. Like, I think civilization is good. Someone asked me to summarize my political identity. I'm a liberal in my compassion for the vulnerable. I'm libertarian in my passion for freedom. I'm conservative in my belief that civilization is required for both. You need civilization. That means that you need functioning public schools, functioning universities. You need to teach algebra and not eliminate algebra before high school. You need police officers. You need the society to believe in these institutions. When I came to this issue out of a totally different issue, and I looked at the ways in which we shut down psychiatric hospitals, I was like, wow, it reminds me of how we're shutting down nuclear power plants. And then we're going to shut down police stations. And now the governor says, he came into SACB in 2019 and said, I might want to shut down a prison, but we'd be really careful about it. Well, now he says he wants to empty 3 prisons. I mean, maybe there's if you can convince us all that you can get those folks rehabilitated and they don't end up homeless on the streets. I have seen a significant increase of former prisoners in homeless encampments in the 3 years that I've been doing my research. So I believe in institutions, I believe in civilization, I believe in the police. I think that is what I would like to explain as governor to everybody, is to say, look, if you're against police violence, you should want more police. You get more police violence when you have fewer police who are stressed out and feel disrespected and don't get the training they need. By the way, it works the same way with nuclear power plants. If you want your nuclear power, if you want Diablo Canyon to be safe, you want the people who work there to be trained. That's all they did after 3 Mile Island, by the way. 3 Mile Island was the best thing for the nuclear power industry because they just made the workers go through these training programs to do the procedures. It's like checklist manifesto. You guys maybe remember this Atul Gawande book. Hospitals work the same way. These institutions of civilization, they need public buy-in. They need voters to understand why these institutions are so important. And that goes for elections. That's why it's so toxic to have people claiming electoral fraud. People have to believe in this country. We have to take responsibility for these institutions. I think I can do a lot as governor to communicate that and to build a societal consent for a pro-civilization agenda.
Grace, you want to ask some comedy questions?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so you've already mentioned once the cost of living in California. What would your plan be to lower the cost of living?
Everything's too expensive here. I mean, we pay super high taxes, right? You should get really good services. You know, we spend more money on mental health and homelessness, and we have the worst outcomes on mental health and homelessness. We poured a huge amount of money into public schools, and student performance has declined significantly. The cost of living, I don't know the exact percent, it's overwhelmingly housing, as all of you know. I mean, I think we have the highest gasoline prices and the second highest electricity prices. I may have transposed those, but I think that's correct. And I'm a big energy advocate. I believe energy should be abundant. I think you need abundant, cheap energy to have abundant water for desalination, water recycling, and storage. But the big event is housing. So I already kind of addressed the housing issue at length, so I won't repeat myself on housing. But you need more housing to reduce the cost of living. At the same time, look, we should recognize that California is a premium state, and that the cost of living is always going to be higher here. And I don't think we're ever going to be like Texas. I was thinking the other day, I was like, I think most Californians don't want to be like Hawaii, but we don't want to be like Texas either. So the Goldilocks principle would be like California should be somewhere in between Hawaii and Texas. Our homes are always going to be more expensive. I mean, it's a premium state. We love it here. The weather's better. We have the freest culture. We're the least snobby. That's why I love it here. One of the reasons. But it's always going to be pretty expensive. But we do need much more abundant housing, and I described what I think matters in terms of getting that.
So one quick follow-up on the housing. You mentioned the citizens jury, but as Ben raised, just the average cost of building units right now tends to be very high.
Yeah.
Would the citizens jury translate into lower building costs, or how do you envision the cost of housing coming down?
I don't know. Sorry, I don't know. It's a hard one. One of my advisors, Jennifer Hernandez, who would probably be able to say a lot about this. But my understanding from her and other folks in the 200 is that those costs are driven by multiple factors. One of which is the fees that the counties impose because they don't get the money that they would have gotten had Prop 13 not passed. So I've taken a tax peace position, meaning no changes. I want to deal with the crisis of California civilization before getting to taxation. That being said, I recognize that we have a tax system that nobody I've ever met thinks is a good tax system. Nobody would have ever created the tax system we have of relatively low property taxes, extremely high taxes on the top-heavy tax system on the high-income earners. I don't want to get into that, at least not for the first term. We'll get into tax issues, maybe second term. But we have so much other stuff to do those first 4 years. I don't want to get into that. So that's not going to change. Then you get into the building trades and the ways in which they manipulate CEQA into, basically keeping their fees high. I don't love the idea of reducing the wages. I'm against reducing the wages of people involved in building houses. That does not strike me as a good idea. I think the minimum wage needs to be high in the state. How could you possibly live as a low-wage worker in the state? We have the highest poverty rate with a minimum wage that's not at a high level, even needs to be higher. So I don't want to change that. So I don't know. I'm not counting on it. I do think if you can build more housing, you do get economies of scale. If you're adding 300,000 units a year rather than 100,000 units a year, I suspect, but don't know and can't prove that the cost of building would be lower.
Got it. Thank you. And then, I may know your answer to this based on what you just said about not wanting to make any changes about taxes, but I do want to ask 2 quick questions about taxes.
Sure.
There have been ongoing discussions about the volatility in California's tax revenue, and some pitches for broader tax reform, including the addition of a sales tax on services to account for the shift to people buying more services. Would you support or push for some sort of broader tax reform along those lines or along, other line?
Nope. Tax peace. Tax peace. We need tax peace for at least 4 years while I'm governor. I'm very proud. I won the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association endorsement. I'm very proud of my endorsement. I stole it from my Republican opponents. And I'm very happy that I won that with a tax peace agenda. I did not promise tax cuts. I'm not going to increase taxes. I will veto any tax increase attempt.
Okay, so you would not support a wealth tax and increase on the income tax?
Absolutely not. Nope.
Thank you.
So I want to I'm Kristen, healthcare reporter. I want to shift us a little bit from the previous conversation.
Yeah.
Healthcare costs are, although I guess this ties into cost of living. So healthcare costs are proportionately higher than they've ever been before.
Yeah.
With deductibles and premiums.
Yep.
The inflation rate for medical costs are 4 times higher than the general rate of inflation.
Right.
I think you've previously talked about, enforcing this law that requires hospitals to post their prices and in that way create a little bit more market pressure.
Yeah.
Which is a lever that I've heard a lot about from economists as something that could be effective.
Yeah.
But it is a big, complicated system. So
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could sort of expand on that and strategies for reducing healthcare costs.
Yeah, and let me say too, I think in some ways, healthcare delivery is the main event. When I talk about homelessness, that issue, in my view, has been misframed as fundamentally a housing issue. It's fundamentally a health and medical issue. So for me, this issue of healthcare delivery is essential. I am philosophically supportive of universal healthcare. I believe that all of our citizens should have healthcare as a moral issue. I think it's wrong that people don't. And to some extent we do. If somebody is shot and bleeding to death and they have no health insurance, we treat them. If you have cancer, we treat you. We make you go bankrupt first. Don't think it's a sensible system. I was much more left-wing. I'm more moderate now. I find a single-payer system to have an elegance to it that I've always appreciated. But I also have been influenced by my wife and my sister and by my Dutch friends, who, my wife is a healthcare policy expert, my sister is a healthcare policy expert, and my Dutch friends in the Netherlands, you may know, they have universal healthcare, but it's through a private insurer model like we have. They basically got there by expanding what we would call Obamacare. Obamacare seemed like a huge mess to me, but I'm persuaded that it was progress. So I'm agnostic on public-private issues in general. In other words, there's about a third of our electrical utilities in the United States are publicly owned. About 2/3 are privately owned and regulated. I'm agnostic about whether they perform better or worse. I think they can go either way. I love the Dutch system in general. I looked at the Dutch for inspiration on a lot of things. So the fact that they were able to get here with this mixed approach, I'm going to get to your question in a second because I know I'm working my way to it. So I'm open. I'm very flexible on how to do that. Let me say one other thing about costs. there is Baumol's disease. So I think we often look at the increasing share of GDP that goes to healthcare and we think it's always a problem, but it's not. Like, as we get richer, we shouldn't spend significantly more and more money on things like food or transportation or clothing or products, but you would expect to spend more money on healthcare. And that's a good thing because we're going to live longer, we want to be healthier. So the higher healthcare cost inflation relative to the rest of GDP, I think some amount of that is okay. Now, we've got a super inefficient system in the United States. It's broken in a variety of ways. So I'm very open to fixing that. Obviously, the thing about the hospitals posting their prices, that's one thing. I mean, you got to negotiate with the providers. And the great thing about if you're the governor of California is you have a lot of power to do that. And Gavin Newsom, you might have noticed, was having dinner at the French Laundry with the healthcare lobbyists. I don't have any support from the healthcare lobbyists, so I'm going to be in a good position to negotiate on all of whether it's drugs or other healthcare services, and I will do that in the same way that I'll stand up to PG&E. I'm not beholden to these big monopoly providers, and we'll be able to demand reasonable compensation. It's messy because these are not true markets, and I think a lot of mistakes get made under the neoliberal model of when we try to treat things that aren't markets as though they are markets. It's really negotiated through politics.
When you talk about being able to flex your power as governor to negotiate on drugs and other healthcare prices, that sounds to me a little bit like single-payer healthcare.
Not necessarily. I mean, you might have different providers. You have different drugs that can do the same thing. Generics being, of course, the great example of it. Why would you not use generics if you can use generics? What are we covering? What sort of things are going to be included in state pension, state public employee healthcare plans? What's going to be included? What's not? There's a fair amount of discretion on those things. I listen to, I read a lot of the Governor for California work by David Crane, looking at, are we overspending on healthcare for public employees? He makes a pretty good case that we are. So there's actually a fair amount that can be negotiated on those things.
Sure.
I tend to just philosophically, I tend to think everybody should have a basic level of care before you have to go to the emergency room for your care. But that there's other things, elective surgeries, just other things that I think are drugs that aren't proven, and there's a lot of them that I think there's bigger questions on, and that would be the place to have more flexibility.
Sure. What about, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on providing immediate relief for Californians, given that, I think a lot of attention, rightly so, goes towards how much the state spends on Medi-Cal, but even for Californians that have health insurance through their employers, like, this is not just a problem of the poor. I think the California Healthcare Foundation had a recent survey showing that 50% of the state of Californians with insurance have delayed or foregone healthcare because they can't afford it.
Yes, that's a problem. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see people, like I said, I'd like to see us get to everybody having coverage in some way or another. What I've said is that let's start with psychiatry and rehab, because we have, I think, a societal consensus, including among pretty conservative folks, that we need to deliver addiction care and psychiatric care to people on the street, even if they don't have health insurance. My conservative friends, when I say people with schizophrenia or addiction are not out there shopping for healthcare providers or health insurers, they get it. My aunt was mentally disabled. She couldn't go searching, she needed to be provided for by taxpayers. So I think we have societal agreement on that. I mean, I am actually proposing a somewhat different paradigm here, which is that the way that the progressives have expanded healthcare coverage over the last few decades is demographically. The elderly, kids, and Obamacare became, young people for several years after they graduated from college. I can't remember, it's at 25, I would suggest that we might do better off to take a different approach to get the rest of the way, which would be let's do psychiatry, let's do addiction care. Again, building in carrots and sticks, building in tough love into that in particular, but I think for other services as well. I mean, we have a pretty good sense now, I think, of what things pay for themselves and what things don't, and that would be where I would want to start, would be the things that pay for themselves. I'm not crazy, I'm not going to be, I have, like, as you can tell, I feel very strongly about some things and others. I feel very strongly we need a statewide psychiatric and addiction care system. I feel very strongly about shelter first, treatment first, housing earned. This thing of immediate relief, I don't love the just giving people money for gas. I don't love the thing of just giving you, if a car is $400. I mean, I think we went through a huge part because of the pandemic of stimulus. I don't love it either as redistribution, which I'm not philosophically against. I don't love it as policy. We need abundant energy. Like gasoline prices should not be as expensive as they are. Electricity prices should not be as expensive as they are. We should have abundant water. I don't think the solution is these short-term kind of giveaways. I think it lends itself to basically bribing voters.
So you're saying you wouldn't love that idea as applied to like healthcare cost relief?
I don't love that idea at all. I'm not saying I would never do it, but I don't like the way it's being done right now.
And you brought up psychiatry and rehab again. I do want to sort of dig in a little bit into your CalPsych proposal.
Great.
Because I guess you talked earlier this afternoon about having sort of your office as the ultimate controller with regional directors.
Yes.
Under a statewide system. But I guess I'm struggling to understand how that differs from having the counties in charge.
Well, so different. I mean, the first thing to understand is that we just can't deliver psychiatric or rehab to all the people that need it in LA or San Francisco or Oakland. And that we just don't have enough shelters, psych beds in hospitals, board and care facilities, group homes, rehab. We just need a lot more institutions. It's one thing you shut down the encampments, I believe in that, but people got to go somewhere. People are sick. They need care, they need treatment long term. So we need those facilities, and where there's no way that you can just provide them county by county. Let me see if this actually will help. Part of the reason I came to this, and this isn't my idea, by the way. There's many other people that had said you need a statewide psychiatric and addiction care system, including Thomas Insel. But when you read all of 30 years, it's depressing. You read 30 years of white papers and government reports on homelessness, and you see the problem get worse and worse. And you read the reports, and they all go, there needs to be better coordination. I just heard Mayor Steinberg saying this. We need better coordination. Forget it. These are little fiefdoms. They don't coordinate. The only way you get stuff done is if it's in a hierarchy. The only way you really get it done is it's in a hierarchy, where your boss, you would do it because you're going to get in trouble with your boss. If it's the neighboring county being like, hey, can you take this schizophrenic fentanyl addict? No thanks, you can keep them in Oakland. That's the problem. So if you have a statewide system, it goes, no. There's two people just got out of, there's a great little rehab facility in Yuba County. They teach, woodworking, Python. They actually have a relationship with CAL FIRE. The workers think they go do a stint with CAL FIRE, and they have 2 openings there. We can get you there right away, and the people in Yuba County are going to help the people in LA because it's their job, as opposed to let's all be friends or coordinate. That doesn't work. Not with public employees, frankly, not with private sector employees. And then there's the administrative duplication, which is just a nightmare. I mean, imagine all of that administrative duplication going from 58 agencies to a single agency.
Do I have time for another, or?
Yeah, I got plenty of time.
Well, let's move on to.
Okay.
This is fun.
You can ask about environment other than nuclear power.
Yeah, so you've spoken at length about your support for the state's last nuclear power plant. But aside from that, what would you do to ensure that the state could meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals? That is 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and ultimately achieving carbon neutrality by 2045.
Nuclear. I mean, so just to set the table a little bit, from 2005 to 2020, the United States reduced our carbon emissions by 22%. This is amazing. How did we do that? Fracking. 61% of that 22% reduction was just gas replacing coal. Gas produces about half the carbon emissions as coal. The other 39% was from renewables, usually weather-dependent renewables, but even those were dependent on the gas revolution, since you can't integrate that amount of solar and wind into the grid without having a lot more gas, since it's hard to ramp coal and nuclear plants up and down. So it's nuclear. Now, okay, we know transportation, that's our biggest source in California. There's a real debate that has not been appreciated among transportation experts about whether this is really going to be a transition from petroleum to lithium or from petroleum to hydrogen gas. My view is I tend to think hydrogen gas for reasons we can go into, and that the hydrogen enthusiasts, including our former Governor Schwarzenegger, were early not wrong. I see the same thing in nuclear, that these technological enthusiasts, almost all of them engineers, they're not wrong, they're just really early. Like, I think we're gonna have fusion one day, just not this century, maybe not next century. Like, we'll have fusion, it's gonna take a while. Same thing with advanced nuclear plants. I'm much more optimistic when it comes to nuclear about the new fuels that you can put in the existing plants. But we know these reactors that everyone has demonized, the water-cooled plants, they've made them a lot safer than they had at Fukushima, 3 Mile Island. Chernobyl was slightly different, but they made them different, but also the new fuels are gonna help a lot. It's gonna take a while for us to get the Bill Gates reactors. But even if you were to have an EV revolution or hydrogen gas, you still have to significantly expand the power sector. In other words, you have to produce that hydrogen gas from the power sector or produce the electricity for the EVs from the power sector to replace all of the petroleum used in transportation in the United States. I've seen calculations that range from a 50% to 100% expansion of the power sector. So that's a pretty big expansion. We've already squeezed most of the coal out of California's electricity, including the imports from out of state. So I don't think there's a lot more reductions we're gonna get from coal to gas. EVs, lithium prices are up. Don't quote me exactly. I think they're up 7-fold over the last year. Teslas were already very expensive. Electric cars were very expensive. Hydrogen fuel cell cars, even more expensive. The main problem, as all of you know, is the refueling stations, getting that up and running. So for me, decarbonize the power sector. Like, that would be the first thing you would do. You decarbonize the power sector, and then you decarbonize heating, cooking, transportation over time. But it's a transition, I believe, towards nuclear. So I would want to see advanced nuclear at San Onofre. We have a great site there. There was 2 reactors there. Could you fit 6 reactors there? Diablo Canyon, my staff and I discovered the blueprints for Diablo Canyon. There was room for 6 reactors, which is really cool. 6 reactors that you could use for power, for hydrogen production, for desalination, even for fertilizer production, which we now know we need. So that would be the direction I would want to go in. I'd want to see. I also think we need more gas. I mean, we're so weird about this. Like, we kind of go, well, we're going to shut down all the oil and gas production in the United States, in California, but we're going to keep using oil and gas for ourselves. And the idea is somehow that if you reduce the supply, then it sends a price signal and that it incentivizes EVs. It doesn't work that way, because energy consumption is highly inelastic, meaning people, you can move it on the margins a bit, but people, they have a commute. They have existing cars. We have this existing infrastructure that relies on oil and gas. So I would like to see more natural gas production in California. I think it's our obligation. We import so much of our energy, about 30% of our electricity. We import, I don't know the exact numbers, significant amount of our oil and gas. We should be increasing them. We need a vision of energy abundance, not just for decarbonization, but also for producing the fresh water that we need so we can get beyond these conflicts between farmers, conservationists, and residents.
Okay, well, so natural gas already accounts for about 40% of electricity on the grid. You're saying we need more gas, but you're also saying that you would support increasing nuclear, which accounts for about 9%.
Right.
So,
well, the world needs more gas right now. We're in the worst energy crisis since 1970. So it's the worst energy crisis in 50 years. The oil and gas sector has been basically sent mixed signals. You know, the last, say, 5 years, the message has been, we're going to shut down the oil and gas industry and move to renewables. Well, then now we're in the worst energy crisis, and the Biden administration is increasing imports of Venezuelan oil, and we're trying to increase gas production. But when you talk to the guys in the oil and gas industry, they say, what are we doing here? We don't have any certainty about what we're supposed to be doing. So there's no plan, there's no vision, not just for California, but for the United States. So yes, the nuclear that I would want to see expanded in California would replace that natural gas. Eventually, it could even replace some of the hydro so that we could actually take down some of the dams without suffering power outages. That's going to be hard to do, but eventually you could do it with a nuclear build out. But we just need more gas in general in the United States. And then I think we've also seen with solar, we've reached the limits of what solar can be in California. I have no philosophical problem with solar. I've got solar panels in my backyard, but we now know that the vast majority of them are produced with Uyghur Muslim labor in concentration camps in China. There's an investigation right now ongoing by the Biden administration about whether they are sneaking those panels through Southeast Asia, and what the status of those solar panel imports are. We also know that we produce so much excess solar that we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year paying other people to take our excess solar when we produce too much of it. And then when we hit, as we did 2 years ago, a summer where it's very hot and people are using their air conditioners after the sun goes down and we don't have enough solar, we still know they're inadequate at those times. So the bottom line is you need a lot more nuclear to deal with the energy shortages and to deal with decarbonization and to deal with the need to create fresh water. I think long-term vision is essential, and I think that we got ourselves down a kind of dogmatic path on renewables, on 100% renewables.
Even with, if the plant in Diablo Canyon were to continue sustaining operations, a lot of people say that there are problems with that, that, it would be costly to ratepayers in the end. It'd be costly to repair the infrastructure involved. I mean, you were talking about how expensive it already is for California, and all these other, for Californians in all these other areas. How would you, prevent this cost from being, put on ratepayers?
Well, just to be clear, that the electricity from that nuclear plant is now much cheaper than electricity either from solar or gas, given what's going on now. Diablo Canyon is also one of the best maintained nuclear plants. It consistently gets in the highest, I believe, highest 20% of NRC's kind of evaluations of plant operations. Diablo Canyon, in part, because I think people are so paranoid about nuclear in California, has always been a well-maintained plant. Now, I do believe they have been deferring some maintenance on it because they have expected to shut it down. Keeping it up and running is going to require a significant amount of work in terms of dealing with NRC. It was the regional water board and the state water board that Gavin used to basically force the closure of Diablo Canyon. There's other complications. There's the community choice aggregations, which also removed customers from PG&E, putting pressure on them to shut down Diablo Canyon. So it's complicated, but the plant itself is in great shape. These light water reactor plants, these Westinghouse design plants, are clearly capable of operating for 60, 80 years, maybe longer. Even if you had to replace the containment domes and the reactor vessels, you still have the whole site there that's all set up and permitted for nuclear. So for me, you have to see nuclear as the backbone of a decarbonized energy system, of which everything else is much less reliable. Our hydroelectric dams, as we know, during a heavy drought period like right now, are not reliable sources of electricity. solar panels are not reliable sources of electricity, and natural gas is prone to significant fluctuations due to global forces and global factors. We always think we're beyond that because we have abundant shale for the fracking revolution, but nonetheless, we now see, for a variety of other reasons, many of them political, gas shortages. So for me, nuclear is the backbone of a decarbonized energy system. I do think Japan's coming back to that. I think South Korea's coming back to that. I think we're seeing France come back to that. France, which has mistreated its own nuclear fleet, now sees the need to maintain that fleet. So look, I mean, nuclear, you just have to remember, it's just cement and rebar and metal and people. I mean, the most important part of that equation is people. But maintaining these plants, it's complex because it's nuclear, it's not a coal plant, but we know how to maintain these plants. If you do it well, you do it regularly, these are plants that can last for 60, 80, 100 years or longer.
So before we run out of time, Joe has some education questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Cool. So you said previously that you would significantly increase school choice.
Yes.
So I want to ask, like, what would more school choice in California look like? And,
Yeah.
You've also cited sort of the low test scores, fewer students being proficient in math and reading. So, yeah. So part one is what would more school choice look like, and, and part two of that question is how would more school choice increase student achievement and well-being?
Yep. So let's start with what is going on, which is that we have seen declining student performance over a period of increased funds for public schools. So we now know less than half of public school students are proficient in reading, about a third are proficient in math, 10% of Black students, 15% of Latino students are proficient in math in our public schools. I think that's in Los Angeles, I'm not sure if that's statewide. These numbers are atrocious. These are civilization-destroying numbers. The governor's people are now pursuing an agenda to eliminate algebra before high school, and in a variety of ways to lower standards, to lower the bar. I think that's insane. I think that is the bigotry of low expectations. There's been a lot of debate, but at the end of the day, how do you improve student performance? Get students studying more. We know that there is a direct relationship between the amount of time students do math or reading and their performance. This seems obvious, but sometimes it feels like the obvious thing is the thing that nobody wants to talk about. Yes, there's structural racism. I'm very sensitive to it. I'm part of organizations that confront it. But we can improve student performance by having students study more. I would like to see longer school days, longer school years, and a school day that reflects the workday so it's easier on parents. I now know, so having talked about that for 4 years, that is, let's say, more popular with some parents than other parents. Not all parents want that. And maybe not all kids need it. I think a lot of kids do. Especially if we're going to be globally competitive. But the right solution is expanded school choice. We've seen student performance improve in Florida, where you had expanded school choice. I think that it's been an issue under debate, but I think that parents are really fed up right now, as I am. After our kids were kept home from 2020 to 2021, while the kids in Europe went back to schools, and while Gavin Newsom sent his own kids to private school for in-classroom instruction. Parents, including myself, I have a 16-year-old daughter, are pretty frustrated by that and think that there's a way in which somehow California schools became for the adults who run them rather than for the students who need them. And I think that the remedy is greater school choice. Now, as someone who's concerned about equity, I do worry that what will occur is that you'll get schools that essentially cream the best students from the top, and then you get a concentration or greater inequality. We don't want that. So there's some reasonable questions that have to be asked. If you expanded school choice, is it just among public schools, or would you include private schools? If you included private schools, what sort of accreditation system would you have? Because we don't want to just have taxpayer money going to some namby-pamby school where the kids don't learn math or reading or anything, or where they teach, where where they're like, we don't want to fund neo-Nazi schools. You got to have some standards for those schools. There was the Republicans. This is an issue that Republicans have owned. They had, there was two coalitions that were trying to get a ballot initiative on school choice on the ballot for this year. They fought. They couldn't get their act together. And they had differences of opinion on these issues. As governor, I'd like to work with them. I'd also like to work with the teachers union. My mom was a teachers union rep. I'm fine with teachers union. I believe in great teachers. Let's work together to figure out how to get greater parental choice. I think that is important to have that competition between schools. I think it's also important to have high standards. And I think we got to do something to make sure that the kids whose parents are not on the ball, that they're not stuck in the bad schools. So for me, that's the way I think about it.
I'm curious because earlier you said, you know, a neoliberal approach is not a solution for everything, but why would it work in the case of K-12 education?
I don't think this is a neoliberal approach.
I mean, competition between schools is kind of...
Okay, I mean, maybe. I've never thought of it that way. I was thinking more of it on what I think of as neoliberal is trying to use pricing mechanisms in a fake market. And that's what I was objecting to in the case of healthcare, but also I think to some extent with electricity. You know, maybe I contradict myself, maybe it is neoliberal, but I think that school choice, we've seen now, there's been enough experiments with it to see the benefits to students. I do think it's not perfect, that there's no perfect solution to it, but I think that I think we see parents in particular whose kids are at underperforming schools gravitate towards it. Parents who, you know, are ambitious, whose kids are ambitious. And I also just think, look, we've had this personalization revolution in almost every aspect of our lives. Healthcare being very dramatic, where we know that our bodies are different, our minds are different. I was terrible at math, by the way, and suffered, you know, for it. But I wish I would have had some kinds of educational opportunities that I didn't have because we had a one-size-fits-all, you know, educational system. So I do think it's just time to get into more personalized education. I don't see it as using fake market approaches. I don't think it's a pricing issue. I think it's more of just a choice issue, and I think I do think there's a competitiveness issue as well.
As governor, would you propose legislation for longer school days and longer school years?
I would actually, yeah, and I should say too, I do think there's actually 3 citizen juries processes I'd like to see going on simultaneously. And I think they should happen simultaneously because I think they have to be considered together. One is on housing, one is on education, and one is on energy and water. If I'm elected, I think I will have a mandate to keep Diablo Canyon open. But I'm sorry to mention this earlier, but I don't think I'd have a mandate to do what needs to be done on decarbonization, nuclear, water. So I'd want to see those 3 citizen juries goes on at the same time. The education one, I think we'd want to see that done by January 2024, so that if the legislature, I think the legislature, just given the control of the teachers union, will be hostile to it. That might be fine, but that would give us time then to get it on the ballot for 2024.
How would you staff an extended school day or an extended school year just because we're already facing such a dire staff shortage?
Yeah, well, look, we're facing a dire public employee staffing shortage like everywhere. Healthcare, policing, schools. It's related to the cost of living. We don't have housing that people can afford. You know, it's like you can raise the wages, but how do people afford homes? So that's why I think these things do have to go together. I don't think there's any simple answer to it. It may be that, I mean, my mom and my stepfather, they worked all summer and other jobs outside of school. I think that's pretty common for teachers, is that they have their salary job as teachers. They do take some of the job in the summer. If we can get them to work a longer school year, if we end up having a school year that's more like 10 and a half months or 10 months, rather than 9 or 8.5 months, then I think we can compensate the folks that are already in the system to work a little bit longer and to not take that summer off and work a different job.
You mentioned the ballot box. Do you foresee having to go to voters for most of the big changes you want to make rather than working with the legislature on those?
I want to work with the legislature to do as much as we can together. My attitude towards the legislature will be of very much openness. I actually think, just coming back full circle to the way we started, I think by being no party preference, I'll be able to work with both sides, including factions in both parties that maybe a Democrat or Republican wouldn't be able to do. If I'm going to say it in a slightly more Machiavellian way, you could say I'll be able to play them off each other a little bit. I think Republicans tend to be a little bit more in favor of hiring more cops. Democrats tend to be a little bit more in favor of universal health care.
Democrats have so much control of the Capitol that
Yeah.
I don't think you can play them off there's not enough Republicans to play Democrats off of.
You might be right, Alexi, and if that's the case, then we will have to go to the ballot box. Obviously, we're going to try to get stuff through the legislature those first 2 years, but if 2024 comes around and we need legislators that are going to implement the will of the people, as has been shaped by those citizen juries, then I'll be able to go out there on the road and help to get the legislators elected who are going to be more aligned with the will of the voters.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation.